In this true crime documentary, we look at one of Ireland's most notorious gangland figures, Eamon Dunne, also known as the Don, and the face of Ireland's gangland during the mid-2000s. Eamon Dunne knew he was a marked man who always had to look over his shoulder because, at any minute, someone would be out to get him. On April 23, 2010, he was sitting in the Fassaugh House pub in Dublin. Moments before he could pay the lounge boy for a soda, his killer arrived. Just minutes earlier, a red VW Passat had pulled up outside the pub located in Cabra, and 3 armed men with their faces covered came out of the car. One of the men stood at the door while the other 2 walked into the pub. This was well planned and orchestrated so that Dunne could not make an escape. Of the 2 men that walked into the pub, one stood back to keep guard while the shooter walked up to Eamon and shouted at terrified punters to get down on the floor. In a desperate move, Dunne grabbed the lounge boy to use him as a human shield. Luckily, someone in close proximity pushed the lounge boy out of the way just before the gunman fired the shots. Over 12 shots were fired in this gangland assassination. 2 shots went directly to the head and 3 others hit vital organs, leaving Dunne with no chance of survival. Graham Farrell, who was with Dunne when he was shot, mentioned that he saw his head splatter and knew that was the end of him. This murder was 15 years ago when a dozen shots sealed the fate of one of Ireland's most violent gangsters. It also slowly signaled the end of one very bloody era and started another. In the years before this well-coordinated hit, Dunne signed his own death warrant when he ordered over 17 murders during a reign of terror as Ireland's most ruthless gang boss. Many believe that criminals from the north side of Dublin carried out the murder, with the orders coming from Christy Kinahan's crime family, who were based in Spain at the time. I have a few videos covering the Kinahan cartel and their notoriety, so if you want to watch some of those, links are in the description. Dunne's former associates are believed to have helped set him up because he had become too violent and saw his killing spree as being bad for business. Being associated with a man like him, who had stepped on so many toes, would eventually put you in the crosshairs of rival factions. A lot has changed in Ireland's gangland over the years after Dunne's death. The gangland murders dropped significantly after the Don was taken out. Just the year before, there were 29 gangland murders in 2009. In 2010, there were 20, including Eamon Dunne's own murder. In 2011, those numbers dropped to 11 murders linked to organised crime. The years that followed saw roughly a dozen gangland murders a year. As well as lowering the number of gangland murders, Dunne's death left a big hole in his gang. They were weakened by his execution, which led to fights over control in the underworld, fights that rising gangs and gangsters wanted to fill. This inevitably led to more violence. One of Dunne's closest allies, Brian O'Reilly, was targeted on 2 separate occasions. In August 2010, a real IRA gang led by Alan Ryan, encouraged by the killing of Dunne, tried to take out O'Reilly in a pub in Bettystown, located in Meath. Ryan's gang was demanding extortion payments from the former associates of Eamon Dunne, who were now seen as weak on the streets following Dunne's death. The same gang also targeted another former ally of Dunne called the untouchable Eamon Kelly. In September 2010, they attempted to shoot him outside his home on Furry Park Road in Killester, a quiet middle-class suburb in North Dublin, located about 5 kilometres from the city centre. It's part of the Dublin 5 postal district and sits between Clontarf, Raheny and Artane. This attack failed because the shooter's gun jammed, but Kelly was eventually shot and killed by them in December 2012. O'Reilly was shot in June 2014 in another attempt on his life outside a gym in Balbriggan, North Dublin. The year before, in 2013, one of O'Reilly's close pals, Derek McLaughlin from Ballymun, was also targeted in May of that year. This happened in a car park at the Castle Shopping Centre in Swords when a gunman walked up to him, but again another hit was foiled because of a jammed gun. Both men were pallbearers at Dunne's funeral. Another man who also carried the coffin was jailed in 2015. Mark Buckley was sent to prison for 2 years after he was convicted with 4 other men for attacking a man in a pub. During the attack, Buckley punched the man, threw a pint glass at him, and used a bar stool to hit the victim while he was on the ground. It's also worth stating that associates of Buckley were believed to be responsible for the murder of Paul Cullen, who was shot and killed in a Cabra pub in March 2013. Other men who carried Dunne's coffin have had a rough time since his death. Brothers Alan and Wayne Bradley from Finglas, along with their associate Geoffrey Morrow, were jailed for their part in a conspiracy to rob a cash van. Another associate of Dunne, Sean Enright, was shot in 2 separate attempts since the Don's death. The bodybuilder cheated death in January 2011 when he was blasted in a parked car outside a house in Clonsilla. The men behind this hit were believed to be the real IRA. He also survived another gun attack outside a gym in Glasnevin in May 2013. Carl Wynne, a man originally from Finglas, was arrested for this shooting. He was a hitman for hire and eventually died in July 2013, days after he himself was shot in a gun attack. The man who was expected to benefit the most from Dunne's death was Micah Kelly, known as the Panda. He didn't live to reap those illegal benefits, as he too was targeted by the real IRA and killed in September 2011. The one criminal who took advantage of both Dunne and Kelly's murders was the gangland boss known as Mr. Big. He cemented himself as the biggest drug dealer in Dublin's north side in the years that followed. While being on top, he too was a target of the real IRA, but avoided the same fate as Kelly by striking first. It is believed that the notorious gangster ordered the murder of Alan Ryan, who was shot and killed in September 2012, creating one of the biggest gangland murder news stories since the murder of Dunne. Another man who thought he would benefit from Dunne's death was Gareth Hopkins from Cabra. Educated at Trinity College in Dublin and going by the moniker Mr. Clean, he created connections with a veteran criminal from Ballyfermot to start a large-scale drug importation scheme, sourcing drugs from Europe. However, he didn't get far with this scheme, as his luck ran out when he was jailed in 2013 for 13 years after admitting to importing more than €29 million worth of cocaine in 2012. A man linked to the missing armed robber and drug dealer Sean Dunne also grew his drug dealing operation after Dunne's death. The 37-year-old man from Donaghmead was based in Meath and ran a major drugs operation suspected of bringing in over €40 million worth of cannabis into Ireland and the UK over a 2-year period. He was arrested over a major drugs bust, but was never charged for it. He remained the main contender for the title to control Dunne's empire. At the very top of the drugs food chain, Eamon Dunne's murder cemented his ruthless reputation as the real godfather of crime. In sanctioning a hit on their own associate, the Kinahan cartel made it clear everyone was a target while they ruled the Irish drugs trade from overseas. Dunne was labelled evil and was said to be a paranoid mess before his death, going on drug-fueled benders and with increased pressure from the Gardaí that affected his bank balance. Some say he was a likeable person, but that likeable exterior was just a mask for his darker nature. Dunne was not the typical criminal that ran in the streets. He was well educated and completed school. A short, bald man, Dunne would appear ordinary to the untrained eye, a man who hated media attention for obvious reasons. If you tried to fill the space left by the death of Eamon Dunne, you wouldn't only have criminal gangs going after you. Law enforcement was watching and trying their best to take down any criminal that chose to rise to the occasion. One notable figure who tried was Christopher Waldron, who was targeted by the Criminal Assets Bureau, who took 2 houses and €20,000 in designer watches. They suspected his lavish life was being funded by the supply of drugs and his association with the murdered Dunne. 2 of Waldron's homes were identified by officers, mainly Christopher Waldron's family home on Killala Road, Cabra, located on Dublin's north side, where he had been arrested before. They sanctioned Waldron so he couldn't sell any of the assets identified, which also included another house on Mellows Road in Finglas. Other items listed were a Rolex watch valued at €17,000 and 2 other women's designer watches. Christopher Waldron is also the brother of convicted drug dealer David Waldron, who was also under investigation for obtaining assets through the proceeds of crime. Let's take a look at who Eamon Dunne was before the dangerous and dreadful life he lived. Eamon Dunne was born in Dublin on the 17th of February 1976 and grew up in the working-class neighbourhoods of Finglas and Cabra, areas long marked by tight community bonds, limited opportunities, and a growing undercurrent of criminal activity. Those who knew him in his youth described a clever, quietly observant boy who didn't fit the stereotype of a street thug. He was articulate, intelligent, and did well enough in school to complete his leaving certificate, something few of his future associates ever achieved. After school, Dunne worked briefly in legitimate jobs. He spent time in the meat wholesale trade and later drove taxis around North Dublin. For a while, he appeared to be heading toward a straightforward life, even running a small motor business that acted as a front for what would soon become his true profession: organised crime. By his mid-20s, Dunne had drifted firmly into Dublin's underworld, where money, loyalty, and violence dictated status. Dunne first made his name under the wing of Martin Marlowe Hyland, a senior drug trafficker who controlled much of North Dublin's heroin and cocaine supply in the early 2000s. Working as one of Hyland's enforcers, Dunne learned the mechanics of large-scale drug importation, street distribution, and the need for control through fear. He was known for precision and discipline, traits that distinguished him from the impulsive violence common in Dublin's gang scene. When Hyland's empire began to crumble amid police pressure and internal distrust, Dunne emerged as a trusted lieutenant, someone capable of managing operations without drawing attention. He used contacts built through legitimate-looking businesses to launder money and move vehicles used in drug deliveries. Garda intelligence later suggested that Dunne was deeply involved in the logistics of trafficking, not just on the streets, but at the wholesale level, coordinating shipments, safe houses, and cash collection. Those who dealt with Dunne described him as calm, deliberate, and almost unnervingly polite. He dressed sharply, spoke softly, and maintained an image that blended businessman with criminal strategist. As his influence grew, he began to form his own network, recruiting from Finglas and Cabra, expanding into neighbouring districts like Ballymun and Phibsborough. His organisation operated with military efficiency. Drugs came in bulk, were cut and packaged in safe flats, then distributed through trusted local dealers. By the mid-2000s, Dunne was considered one of the most powerful figures in Dublin's criminal hierarchy. His wealth grew rapidly, reflected in cars, properties, and overseas connections. Yet he remained low profile compared to flashier gang leaders. He preferred quiet authority and loyalty enforced through reputation rather than public displays of wealth. Garda sources credited him with running one of the most disciplined supply chains in the capital, controlling territory that stretched across North Dublin and parts of Meath. Despite the growing Garda attention, Dunne was rarely caught with drugs or cash. He operated through intermediaries, avoided electronic communication when possible, and insulated himself behind layers of trusted associates. In the years before his downfall, he had become both feared and respected, a man viewed as intelligent enough to build an empire and ruthless enough to protect it. By 2010, Eamon the Don Dunne had transformed from a quiet boy from Finglas into the dominant figure of Dublin's underworld, a criminal whose name carried the weight of authority across Ireland's capital. After Eamon Dunne was gunned down inside that Dublin pub, Gardaí feared the worst, that his death would trigger a full-scale gangland war. For years, Dunne had ruled his territory in North Dublin with fear and violence. Once he was gone, everyone wanted a piece of what he left behind. Tensions exploded almost immediately. Detectives believed that some of Dunne's own bodyguards had stood aside during the hit, suggesting that his murder was an inside job. He had armed protection with him that night, but when the masked gunman stormed in, nobody lifted a finger. Garda sources later said those same associates were likely in on the hit. It was betrayal from within, the people closest to him wanting him gone, hungry for his empire. But Dunne's downfall didn't just spark problems inside his old crew. An external threat emerged too, a faction calling itself the Real IRA. These were dissident Republicans who had long mixed politics with organised crime. Once Dunne was out of the picture, they moved in on his former turf. They started extorting dealers, taking cuts from the trade, and using their so-called revolutionary image as cover for drug dealing. Within months, a deadly feud erupted between what was left of Dunne's gang and this Real IRA group. The killings came one after another. Colm Owens, one of Dunne's old friends and drivers, was shot dead in Finglas in July 2010. Then Sean Winters, another senior member, was gunned down in Portmarnock that September. Gardaí believed the Real IRA was behind both murders, sending a clear message: they were taking over. Dunne's loyalists didn't back down. They hit back hard. One of their first retaliations was the killing of Daniel Gaynor, a 25-year-old gunman tied to the real IRA. Gaynor was known as a hired shooter, and his murder was payback for the attacks on Dunne's men. It became a cycle of bloodshed, a shadow war between gangland figures and dissident Republicans. This uneasy clash raged across 2010 and into the next year. But it ended as violently as it began. In 2012, Alan Ryan, the Dublin leader of the real IRA, was shot dead in broad daylight. His murder was widely believed to have been carried out by criminals sick of his extortion rackets. Ryan's death effectively dismantled the real IRA's power in Dublin. With him gone, the turf war faded out and the city's underworld calmed. Surprisingly, the massive bloodbath Gardaí had feared never fully happened. After Dunne's murder, there were flare-ups, but nothing like the all-out war many expected. Finglas and Cabra went quieter. No new Don stepped up with the same arrogance or brutality. The violence cooled off, and Gardaí noticed a drop in gangland killings in the years that followed. Dunne's death, in a strange way, brought temporary peace. But beneath the surface, the drug trade kept moving. Dunne's gang had once dominated North Dublin's supply lines, importing cocaine and heroin, distributing to smaller crews, and controlling the streets. When he was alive, he sourced his drugs from larger traffickers abroad, mainly the Kinahan cartel based in Spain. He was one of their biggest Irish distributors. By 2009, though, Dunne's ego had become a problem. He'd killed too many people, brought too much attention, and was undercutting other dealers by selling cheap cocaine. His suppliers, including Kinahan's network, were furious. They warned him to stop, to raise his prices and calm down. But Dunne refused. He was high on power and cocaine, convinced he couldn't be touched. That arrogance sealed his fate. By early 2010, the Kinahan group and at least one older Dublin godfather, a mentor of Dunne's, quietly agreed he had to go. He was bad for business. Garda sources later suggested that some of his own lieutenants helped set him up, working with hitmen from the inner city to carry out the ambush. The Don had become a liability, and the underworld decided to remove him. After his murder, his crew splintered. Some parts of his network were taken over by his former right-hand men. Others aligned with rival factions, but everyone kept a low profile. They'd seen what happened when someone got too loud, too violent, and too visible. The result was a quieter, more business-like underworld, one where money flowed more than bullets. The cocaine and heroin routes kept running, mostly through the same Spanish suppliers, but with new faces handling distribution. Without Dunne, there was no chaos, no daily gunfire. The trade became less public, more organized. Garda intelligence at the time described the city's criminal scene as calmer, less murder, more quiet deals. By the mid-2000s, a new generation began to rise. Younger bosses in areas like Finglas and Blanchardstown, including the figure later known as Mr. Flashy, took over where Dunne once ruled. They too built links with the Kinahan cartel, keeping the supply chain alive. Violence would return in time, but for several years after 2010, Dublin's gangland was fractured and subdued, a stark contrast to Dunne's reign of terror. The investigation into Dunne's murder became one of the biggest in modern Irish history. Dozens of detectives were assigned to track down his killers. Early reports suggested 4 gunmen were involved, possibly including hired hitmen. Gardaí looked at 2 main theories. 1, that the Kinahan cartel ordered the hit from abroad, and 2, that Dublin crime figures, including Dunne's own allies, turned on him. Both turned out to be partly true. Gardaí later concluded that local gangsters carried it out, possibly with quiet approval from senior figures overseas. Several suspects were arrested in the following years, but no one was ever charged. Some were later targeted themselves. One suspected hitman even had his home sprayed with bullets after being released. To this day, the case remains unsolved. No one has ever been convicted of killing Eamon Dunne. Gardaí still call the file open, but in reality, everyone on the streets knows what happened. His murder was a professional hit, clean, fast, and perfectly executed. Eamon Dunne's story became a warning in Irish gangland. He had it all: money, fear, power, and he lost it because he couldn't control himself. His paranoia, his greed, and his violence made him untouchable for a while, until the people around him decided he wasn't. His death changed everything. It stopped one of Dublin's bloodiest feuds, stabilized the drug trade, and reminded every gangster that nobody, not even the Don, was beyond reach. For a while, Dublin's streets were quieter, not safer, but more controlled. And in that silence, the lesson was clear: the louder you rise, the harder you fall.